It was June 30th, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were still smoldering from the relentless Allied assault that had begun just 25 days earlier on D-Day. What the world saw as a successful landing operation was, for the German High Command, a nightmare unfolding at an impossible pace. Tanks were burning, bunkers reduced to rubble, soldiers scattered across hedgerows, and panic had begun to ripple through the ranks of what was once one of the most feared armies in the world. Visual: close-up of wrecked German bunkers, destroyed tanks, chaotic soldiers retreating. Amid this chaos stood a man who had seen wars rise and fall, a man whose experience spanned decades, and who had commanded some of Germany's most elite forces. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, a veteran of both world wars, surveyed the destruction with eyes that had witnessed history repeating itself in the most brutal ways. He understood, with chilling clarity, what others could not or refused to see. Visual: dramatic close-up of von Rundstedt in uniform, maps spread across a table, letters and reports scattered around. Von Rundstedt sent a message that would resonate through history, a blunt and desperate plea: "Make peace, you fools." These words were not a surrender. They were a warning, a desperate recognition of reality in the midst of widespread delusion. In the highest echelons of the German military, where pride, ideology, and hubris dominated, such words were revolutionary and utterly ignored. Visual: animated telegram or letter being typed, slow zoom on text. To grasp the gravity of von Rundstedt's plea, we must first understand the stakes. By late June 1944, the Allies had already landed over 156,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and nearly 11,000 aircraft on the beaches of Normandy. The operation was unprecedented, meticulously planned, and overwhelmingly powerful. Every hour that passed saw German positions overrun, supply lines cut, and units trapped by the tidal advance of Allied forces. Visual: map overlay showing Allied beachhead expansion, Panzer divisions attempting to move, chaotic retreats. The German High Command was paralyzed by ideology and rigid hierarchy. Hitler, convinced of victory despite mounting evidence to the contrary, refused to allow retreats or tactical withdrawals. Orders were contradictory, often impossible to execute, and communication between front lines and command centers was erratic at best. Panzer divisions, the elite armored units that had once terrified the Allies, were trapped in bureaucratic limbo, unable to strike where they were most needed. Visual: archival footage of Panzer units immobilized, soldiers waiting for impossible orders. Von Rundstedt, witnessing the unfolding disaster, saw the truth with absolute clarity. He knew that the continued resistance in the face of overwhelming Allied strength was doomed to fail. His telegram, calling on the German High Command to negotiate peace, was not a statement of cowardice. It was a statement of reason in a situation that had become logistically, strategically, and morally impossible to sustain. Visual: dramatic reenactment of von Rundstedt pacing in a war room, maps spread before him, tense officers around the table. Picture the scene in the German command centers. Officers in fine uniforms, medals glinting under the dim lights, argued over hypothetical counterattacks while chaos reigned in the field. Communications were fragmented. Reports from the front lines were delayed, contradictory, or outright ignored. The morale of troops was crumbling as men faced impossible odds, outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. And in this moment, von Rundstedt dared to speak a truth that many feared to acknowledge. Visual: soldiers hunkered in hedgerows, artillery shells exploding nearby, smoke and fire engulfing the landscape. His words, "Make peace, you fools," were both a warning and a plea. He knew that Germany could not sustain this fight without catastrophic losses. He knew that the destruction of Normandy would accelerate into the collapse of the Western Front. Yet, within the echoing halls of the High Command, these words were treated as defeatist nonsense, a reflection of the disconnect between those planning war and those living it. Visual: montage of destroyed German tanks, wounded soldiers, Allied artillery advancing, smoke billowing. But what led to this desperate message? Why did von Rundstedt, A man renowned for discipline, loyalty, and military prowess, suddenly advocate for peace in the middle of a war. The answer lies in the combination of brilliant Allied strategy, overwhelming manpower, air superiority, and the stubborn rigidity of German command. Visual: animated overlay showing Allied troop movements, Panzer divisions delayed, air strikes hitting key positions. Allied forces had executed Operation Overlord with precision. The beaches were secured faster than German planners anticipated. Air and naval superiority prevented reinforcements from reaching critical points. German soldiers, including some of the most experienced and elite Panzer units, were repeatedly delayed, misdirected, or destroyed before they could impact the battle. Von Rundstedt recognized that continuing the fight was no longer a matter of skill or bravery. It had become literally impossible to halt the Allied advance under the existing conditions. Visual: B-roll of soldiers retreating, destroyed bridges, bombed roads, tanks stuck in craters. Von Rundstedt's telegram was a rare instance of clarity in an environment clouded by pride, ideology, and panic. It is a moment that demonstrates the tension between reason and obedience, between strategic foresight and political loyalty. It was a call for action, for pragmatism, and for the avoidance of needless destruction, an attempt to influence the fate of an entire nation. Visual: dramatic reenactment of von Rundstedt handing a telegram to a messenger. Officer reading with shock. As we move through this story, you will witness the consequences of ignoring reason, the human cost of arrogance, and the unfolding drama of a nation teetering on the brink of collapse. You will see how one man's insight could not overcome the rigid, dangerous, and impossible mindset of Germany's wartime leadership. Visual: montage of war-torn Normandy, Allied forces advancing, smoke rising from villages, soldiers in desperate retreats. Von Rundstedt's plea would not be heeded. The High Command, trapped in ideology and fear of Hitler's wrath, continued their futile resistance. And yet, his message remains a stark reminder of what can happen when strategy, honesty, and humanity collide with pride and denial. Visual: close-up of von Rundstedt in thought, looking at maps, the shadows of destruction reflected on his face. The next chapters will take you deeper into the context, the build-up, and the unimaginable events that followed. You will understand why Germany's elite forces, once considered unstoppable, were faced with an impossible nightmare, why von Rundstedt's voice of reason went unheard, and how the choices made in those 25 days reshaped the course of World War II in Western Europe. To understand the gravity of von Rundstedt's desperate plea on June 30, 1944, we must first step back and examine the historical context that led to this impossible situation. By early 1944, Germany's Western Front was in a precarious position. Months of Allied planning had culminated in Operation Overlord, a massive amphibious assault designed to liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. The German High Command, confident in their defensive fortifications, underestimated the scale, speed, and precision of the coming attack. Visual: slow pan over the Atlantic Wall fortifications, bunkers, tank traps, and artillery emplacements. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, a series of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions. Hitler believed that this network of defenses would make any Allied landing impossible, or at least extremely costly. The German generals, including von Rundstedt and his deputy, Field Marshal Rommel, disagreed about tactics. Von Rundstedt favored a flexible defense, allowing armored units to respond strategically after the initial landings. Rommel, obsessed with stopping the Allies at the beaches, wanted to concentrate forces at the coastline for immediate counterattacks. Visual: archival photos of Rommel inspecting the Atlantic Wall, soldiers installing mines and obstacles. Tensions within the German command structure were compounded by Hitler's increasing micromanagement. By 1944, Hitler's trust in his generals had eroded, replaced with paranoia and ideological rigidity. Even the most competent commanders were restricted from executing decisive maneuvers, bound by contradictory orders from Berlin. For von Rundstedt, a seasoned strategist who had fought in 2 world wars, this was both frustrating and dangerous. Visual. Reenactment of German High Command meetings, heated discussions, generals frustrated over maps. Meanwhile, the Allies were preparing meticulously. By June 1944, over 156,000 troops, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft were poised to cross the English Channel. The operation involved months of deception campaigns, including Operation Fortitude, designed to mislead the Germans into thinking the main landing would occur at Pas-de-Calais. Every detail was calculated to create confusion, maximize surprise, and overwhelm German defenses within days. Visual. Animated map showing Operation Overlord deception plans, fake camps, dummy tanks, and aircraft. When D-Day finally arrived on June 6, 1944, the Germans were caught off guard. The beaches of Normandy, heavily fortified yet undermanned in critical sectors, were stormed by waves of Allied soldiers under brutal fire. German artillery positions and bunkers could not repel the sheer scale of the assault. Communication lines were disrupted by Allied air attacks, and command decisions were delayed or ignored. Visual. Black and white footage of Omaha and Utah beaches, soldiers landing under fire, smoke, and explosions. Von Rundstedt's role during this period was crucial. As Commander-in-Chief West, he had overall responsibility for the German forces in France. He observed the unfolding disaster firsthand, seeing elite Panzer divisions trapped in logistics paralysis, unable to respond to the landing because Hitler had reserved their deployment until he personally approved it. This delay would prove catastrophic. Visual. Panzer divisions attempting to mobilize, tanks stuck in mud, roads blocked by destroyed infrastructure. The German defensive strategy was further weakened by internal disagreements. Rommel argued for an aggressive coastal defense, believing that any delay would allow the Allies to consolidate their position. Von Rundstedt, in contrast, advocated for a mobile defense strategy, holding back armored units until the beachhead could be accurately assessed, then launching targeted counterattacks. These conflicting approaches, combined with Hitler's interference, paralyzed decision-making. Visual. Animated diagrams showing Rommel's coastal focus versus von Rundstedt's mobile defense, arrows indicating blocked orders. By June 30th, the Allied forces had already made significant advances inland. Towns were liberated, supply lines secured, and German positions increasingly encircled. Von Rundstedt realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. The once formidable German army, particularly the elite armored panzer units, was now vulnerable to being destroyed piecemeal. Every hour wasted in indecision brought the Western Front closer to total collapse. Visual. Maps showing Allied advances inland, German units isolated, destroyed bridges and roads. Von Rundstedt's desperation was compounded by morale issues among German troops. Soldiers on the front lines witnessed their comrades killed or captured, supplies running low, and the once disciplined ranks beginning to fracture. Letters from the field described chaos, fear, and confusion, a stark contrast to the confident reports sent back to Berlin, often censored or modified to hide the truth. Visual. Close-ups of soldiers reading letters, faces etched with fear and exhaustion. Allied air superiority added another layer of impossibility. Fighter planes and bombers patrolled constantly, targeting transportation routes, supply depots, and panzer movements. Attempts to regroup or counterattack were met with devastating precision. Von Rundstedt knew that Germany's armored units could not reach the front lines in time, and any attempt would be destroyed before it could make an impact. Visual. Animated overlay of Allied air raids destroying convoys and supply lines, tanks burning. Amid this chaos, von Rundstedt made a bold and unprecedented decision. He drafted a telegram to the German High Command, a message that cut through ideology and arrogance, blunt in its clarity: "Make peace, you fools." He understood that the war in the West had entered an impossible phase, where further resistance would only guarantee destruction. Visual. Reenactment of von Rundstedt writing the telegram, tense officers observing, maps scattered across the table. This telegram was more than a plea, it was a strategic diagnosis. Von Rundstedt recognized that Germany's options were rapidly disappearing. Allied numbers and firepower were overwhelming, morale was crumbling, and internal command conflicts were paralyzing effective decision-making. Every delay in responding to reality magnified the human and material cost. Visual. Dramatic montage of destroyed panzer divisions, retreating troops, and advancing Allied forces. Yet, despite the urgency, the High Command largely ignored his warnings. Hitler's inner circle was unwilling to confront the truth, bound by ideology and the fear of treason. Von Rundstedt's insight, born from decades of experience, collided with the rigid, impossible mindset of Nazi leadership, a conflict that would shape the outcome of the Normandy campaign and the fate of Germany itself. Visual. Slow zoom on von Rundstedt, thoughtful, with maps and reports reflecting the encroaching Allied advance. In summary, the stage was set, a powerful Allied force advancing relentlessly, German defenses in chaos, panzer divisions immobilized, and one experienced field marshal recognizing the impossible odds that lay ahead. The next chapter will reveal the core drama, the battles, the decisions, and the shocking events that followed von Rundstedt's desperate plea for reason. By the last week of June 1944, the Allied foothold in Normandy was no longer just a beachhead, it had become a raging, unstoppable tide moving inland. The German High Command faced the reality of a battlefield slipping entirely from their control. Despite having some of the most elite armored units in the world, the panzer divisions were paralyzed by impossible circumstances, delayed orders, disrupted communications, and relentless Allied airstrikes that turned every road and bridge into a death trap. Visual. Panzer tanks attempting to mobilize, stuck in mud, columns being bombed by Allied aircraft. Von Rundstedt watched in horror as his units struggled to reach the front lines. These were Germany's finest, trained to execute rapid maneuvers and decisive counterattacks, yet many never even reached the battlefield in time. Allied air superiority ensured that any movement along major roads was met with bombing, strafing, and artillery. Tanks burned in rows, fuel supplies were destroyed, and soldiers were forced to abandon their equipment. Visual. Smoke rising from destroyed tanks, soldiers running under air attack, aerial footage of bombed convoys. The battlefield itself had become a nightmare of chaos and destruction. Towns that had once stood as strategic points were now reduced to rubble. Hedgerows, which had previously offered cover, became death traps as artillery shells tore through the terrain. Each passing hour magnified the impossibility of German counteraction. Visual. Slow pan across destroyed villages, craters, abandoned equipment, wounded soldiers. Despite these impossible odds, the German command attempted a series of desperate counterattacks. Panzer divisions were ordered to strike Allied flanks, but by the time they reached their positions, the situation had shifted. Allied troops had fortified their advances, dug in with artillery, and prepared ambushes. Every German attack ended in massive losses, tanks destroyed, and morale crumbling further. Visual. Animated maps showing panzer counterattacks failing, arrows stopped by Allied defenses, explosions. Von Rundstedt's telegram, "Make peace, you fools," was sent in the midst of this carnage. It was an acknowledgement that the entire strategy had become impossible to execute effectively. The Allied momentum was unstoppable, their forces, coordinated with air, land, and naval superiority, left little room for recovery. Even a brilliant maneuver could not have prevented the inevitable collapse. Visual. Reenactment of von Rundstedt pacing in a war room, maps covered with red lines indicating lost positions. Meanwhile, the Allies pressed their advantage with terrifying efficiency. Paratroopers and commandos cut supply lines, tanks spearheaded breakthroughs into the German rear, and infantry pushed relentlessly into towns and villages. The chaos on the ground mirrored the chaos in the German command centers. Officers argued furiously over impossible orders, trying to reconcile Hitler's demands with the stark reality of the battlefield. Visual. Soldiers advancing through bombed villages, Allied tanks in motion, German troops retreating. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of soldiers, many young conscripts, were killed or captured in these frantic battles. Entire panzer battalions were destroyed within hours. Von Rundstedt, with decades of experience, knew that each delay, each failed counterattack, made Germany's position increasingly impossible. Every order sent from Berlin seemed detached from reality, as if the high command existed in an entirely different war. Visual: close-up of soldiers' exhausted faces, letters from home, abandoned gear scattered across fields. As the days passed, Allied forces began to encircle key German positions. Supply depots were lost, bridges destroyed, and reinforcements cut off. The once feared panzer divisions now found themselves trapped and isolated, their mobility crippled. Von Rundstedt understood that the destruction of these elite units was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. Visual: animated overlay showing trapped panzer units, Allied advances highlighted, supply routes blocked. The battlefield became a theater of relentless pressure. Artillery barrages pummeled the German lines, while Allied aircraft patrolled relentlessly. Soldiers faced constant threats from all directions, tanks advancing, infantry closing in, and airstrikes raining from above. The coordination that had once made German armored units so effective had been shattered by overwhelming force and impossible logistics. Visual: montage of burning tanks, soldiers taking cover, explosions everywhere. In the high command, von Rundstedt's warnings were largely dismissed as defeatist. Hitler's inner circle refused to acknowledge the impossibility of the situation, convinced that with enough bravery, discipline, and sacrifice, the tide could be reversed. Orders were contradictory, panzer units were sent piecemeal into impossible battles, and every day brought new waves of destruction. Visual: close-up of telegrams being ignored, generals arguing over maps, tense faces. Von Rundstedt's despair grew as he observed the unfolding disaster. He had spent decades studying strategy, leading armies, and understanding logistics, yet now his insight into what was militarily possible was ignored. His telegram was more than advice, it was a strategic prophecy, foretelling the inevitable collapse of Germany's Western Front if the madness continued. Visual: reenactment of von Rundstedt looking at maps, his hand covering his face. War room in chaos. The sheer intensity of these 25 days cannot be overstated. Allied forces, having secured the beaches, now pushed inland with tactical precision, while German defenses crumbled under impossible pressure. Soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, fought a battle that had already been lost on paper. Villages became tombs, tanks became funeral pyres, and every failed maneuver reminded von Rundstedt of the futility of their resistance. Visual: slow-motion footage of soldiers running under fire, explosions, panzer divisions destroyed. By June 30, 1944, the core drama of Normandy had reached its peak. Von Rundstedt's telegram, sent days earlier, encapsulated the grim reality of war. The German high command was locked in an impossible struggle, blind to the inevitability of their defeat. The stage was set for the consequences of pride, bureaucracy, and strategic miscalculations, one man's desperate plea standing as a lone voice amid the chaos. By the end of June 1944, the battlefield in Normandy had already descended into chaos, and the German high command remained paralyzed by ideology, rigid hierarchy, and sheer disbelief. Orders were contradictory, communication lines were fragmented, and elite panzer divisions were either immobilized or annihilated in piecemeal attacks. Yet, within this chaos, a series of unexpected twists would unfold, moments that demonstrated the fragility of command and the unpredictability of war. Visual: animated map highlighting trapped panzer divisions, Allied advances cutting off retreat routes. One of the most surprising elements of this period was the partial recognition of von Rundstedt's warnings by some German commanders, who secretly began to consider contingency plans for peace or negotiated surrender. Despite the impossible orders from Berlin, certain officers realized that continuing the fight could result in total annihilation of the Western Front and possibly the entire German war effort. These officers, constrained by loyalty yet guided by pragmatism, attempted discreet communication with colleagues to assess Germany's realistic options. Visual: close-up of confidential telegrams being drafted, secret meetings between officers, tense glances. Meanwhile, The Allies were exploiting the chaos with unrelenting precision. Airstrikes continued to devastate roads and supply lines, paratroopers infiltrated behind German positions, and armored units executed flanking maneuvers that caught the German defenders by surprise. In many instances, entire Panzer battalions were cut off from reinforcements and destroyed before they could even reach the front. Visual: explosions engulfing columns of German tanks, aerial shots of advancing Allied forces, soldiers scrambling. A particularly dramatic twist occurred during the battle for Caen, one of Normandy's most strategic cities. German forces, including several elite panzer divisions, were positioned to defend the city and mount counterattacks against Allied advances. But due to delayed orders from Hitler and interference from the High Command, these divisions were unable to act decisively. Allied forces, sensing hesitation, launched a concentrated assault that shattered German defenses, forcing a retreat and leaving behind entire units destroyed or captured. Visual: animated map showing German retreats, Allied forces closing in, burning tanks. Amid this disaster, von Rundstedt continued to press for rational action. He repeatedly communicated the futility of continued resistance, warning that unless a change in strategy or a negotiated peace occurred, Germany's forces in the West would face catastrophic losses. Yet, Hitler's ideology and paranoia rendered these warnings effectively invisible. The twist here was cruelly ironic. Even as von Rundstedt's assessment proved accurate hour by hour, those in power refused to act, trapped by their own delusions of invincibility. Visual: close-up of von Rundstedt with maps, hands trembling slightly as he studies positions, officers dismissing his concerns. Another unexpected turn emerged from the human element on the battlefield. Amid chaos and overwhelming pressure, acts of bravery and improvisation by individual soldiers briefly altered the tide of specific skirmishes. German infantrymen and tank crews, facing impossible odds, managed to slow Allied advances in isolated areas, creating pockets of resistance that delayed the Allies' consolidation of the Normandy region. These moments of heroism, however, could not change the overall trajectory of the campaign. They were temporary reprieves in an otherwise unstoppable Allied advance. Visual: soldiers firing from hedgerows, tanks engaging enemy units, smoke and explosions creating dramatic tension. In addition, internal fractures within the German High Command added an unexpected layer of complexity. Some officers, quietly aligned with von Rundstedt's reasoning, began documenting the impossibility of the situation, highlighting the systemic failures in logistics, communication, and strategy. They attempted to persuade superiors to allow tactical withdrawals or negotiated truces. While these efforts were largely ignored, they reveal an important twist. Even in a rigidly hierarchical and ideologically driven system, rational voices persisted, quietly defying the impossible order to fight to the last man. Visual: reenactment of officers secretly meeting, exchanging notes, whispering urgently. The Allies, sensing these fractures, exploited them strategically. Psychological operations and propaganda aimed at German troops increased defections and surrenders. Leaflets dropped from planes warned soldiers that continued resistance was futile and that the Allies offered humane treatment if they surrendered. Many German soldiers, already exhausted and demoralized by the impossible odds, began to question their orders, creating further internal instability. Visual: leaflets fluttering to the ground, soldiers hesitating, small groups surrendering. A particularly shocking revelation came from intelligence intercepted by the Allies. German commanders were aware, in private, of the futility of continued combat, but were constrained by fear of Hitler's wrath. Von Rundstedt's famous plea, "Make peace, you fools," was not merely a statement of strategy. It was a recognition that the war had become impossible to win. Yet the inability to act on this insight set the stage for one of the bloodiest months in Normandy. Visual: dramatic reenactment of von Rundstedt dictating a telegram, messengers rushing to carry it, high command officers reading it with dismissive expressions. The twist reaches its most ironic point when considering the sheer human cost. Thousands of German soldiers, some of the best-trained units in the Wehrmacht, were lost to decisions that could have been mitigated if reason had prevailed. Von Rundstedt's foresight, based on decades of military experience and understanding of battlefield logistics, clashed directly with ideology, pride, and delayed decision-making. The battlefield became a theater of the impossible, where bravery alone could not overcome strategic collapse. Visual montage of burning Panzer divisions, Allied troops advancing, smoke-filled skies, soldiers retreating under fire. In essence, the unexpected turn was twofold. First, the partial recognition of reality by some German officers, which had no real effect due to hierarchical paralysis. Second, the isolated acts of courage on the battlefield, which temporarily slowed the Allies but could not prevent the inevitable. These twists demonstrate a crucial lesson in history. Even the most calculated plans can be rendered futile when command, communication, and ideology collide with overwhelming force. Visual animated maps showing shrinking German positions, Allied advances, isolated resistance points marked with red highlights. By the end of June 1944, von Rundstedt's desperate warnings remained largely unheeded, yet the chaos and fragmentation of German forces revealed the truth he had articulated. The situation had become impossible to reverse. The Allies' momentum was unstoppable, German command was paralyzed, and the once-feared Panzer divisions were gradually being destroyed, piece by piece. By early July 1944, the impossible nightmare that had begun with the D-Day landings was fully realized. Germany's Western Front was unraveling at an alarming rate. Von Rundstedt's urgent plea, "Make peace, you fools," had fallen on deaf ears, a voice of reason ignored in a whirlwind of pride, ideology, and rigid command. Yet the story does not end with mere tragedy. It ends with a stark lesson about the consequences of delayed decisions, ignored warnings, and the human cost of hubris. Visual dramatic close-up of von Rundstedt, hand on chin, staring at maps filled with red markings indicating lost territory. The Allied advance had become unstoppable. Normandy, once a region fortified by the Atlantic Wall, was now a landscape of devastation. Key towns and cities had been liberated, supply lines for the Germans were shattered, and remaining Panzer divisions were either destroyed or immobilized. Von Rundstedt, though still commanding what remained of the German forces, understood the impossibility of turning the tide. Each passing hour saw the destruction of what had been elite formations, the pride of the Wehrmacht, reduced to rubble under Allied artillery and air strikes. Visual smoke rising over destroyed Panzer columns, aerial shots of Allied forces consolidating gains, retreating German troops. Yet even in this bleak scenario, dramatic human stories emerged. Soldiers, facing impossible odds, displayed courage and ingenuity. Small units managed temporary successes, delaying enemy advances, rescuing trapped comrades, or holding critical positions for hours under overwhelming pressure. These acts, though heroic, were ultimately fleeting. The broader strategic reality was clear. The German High Command had orchestrated its own downfall by ignoring reason, mismanaging resources, and failing to adapt to the reality on the ground. Visual soldiers defending a hedgerow, artillery explosions around them, temporary victory before retreat. The impossibility of the situation also highlighted the stark contrast between battlefield realities and high command delusions. Hitler and his inner circle continued to demand impossible counterattacks, convinced that the Allies could be repelled through sheer willpower. Orders flowed down that contradicted themselves, creating confusion and panic at every level. Von Rundstedt's once respected voice of reason was drowned out by ideology, fear, and bureaucracy. Visual reenactment of generals in a war room arguing, officers looking frustrated, maps covered in red ink and notes. Meanwhile, the Allies capitalized on every weakness. Combined arms tactics, coordinated movements of infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft ensured that German forces were isolated and overwhelmed. Logistic networks were severed, armored units trapped in destroyed roads and muddy fields, and reinforcements unable to reach critical points in time. Each failed German maneuver confirmed the truth that von Rundstedt had recognized weeks earlier. The situation was irreversibly impossible. Visual, animated overlays showing Allied encirclements, destroyed bridges, cut off German units. But the final twist lay not in the battlefield alone, it was political and human. Von Rundstedt's plea had highlighted the possibility of negotiated peace, a reality that might have saved thousands of lives. Yet the High Command's inaction meant that Germany would instead endure months of brutal combat, resulting in staggering losses on both sides. Historians later reflected that had von Rundstedt's advice been heeded, the trajectory of Western Europe could have been dramatically altered, sparing countless civilians and soldiers from death and destruction. Visual. Letters from soldiers, refugees fleeing destroyed towns, ruins of villages, burning bridges. As the weeks progressed, von Rundstedt was forced to implement emergency defensive measures with depleted forces. Every tactical choice was constrained by the impossibility of the situation. His warnings about fuel shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and encircled divisions were repeatedly ignored. The very forces Germany had relied upon to repel the Allies, the Panzer divisions, the Luftwaffe support, and elite infantry units, were systematically neutralized. Visual. Panzer divisions destroyed, Luftwaffe planes shot down, infantry retreating under fire. This culmination of impossible circumstances underscores the drama of von Rundstedt's message. He had foreseen the catastrophe, attempted to mitigate it with reason, and yet was powerless against the structural and ideological flaws of the German military machine. His telegram, simple yet profound, encapsulates the tension between strategy and pride, foresight and hubris, logic and ideology. Visual. Close-up of the telegram text overlay, "Make peace, you fools," with slow fade to battlefield imagery. The final scenes of this 25-day nightmare reveal the consequences. Entire divisions annihilated, towns leveled, families displaced, and thousands of lives lost. The impossible became reality not through the enemy's brilliance alone, but through the refusal of Germany's leadership to adapt to facts and act with prudence. Von Rundstedt had attempted to prevent disaster, but in the end, even experience and insight could not overcome the machinery of hubris. Visual. Wide shots of the Normandy countryside devastated, Allied troops marching, German survivors retreating. Yet there is a lingering question, a historical cliffhanger. What if von Rundstedt had been listened to? Old early peace talks have ended the Western Front sooner, preserving lives and infrastructure? Could Germany have avoided the complete decimation of its elite forces? Or was the collapse inevitable, given the overwhelming force of the Allied invasion? These questions remain haunting, and they underline the dramatic reality of war. Sometimes the impossible is seen too late. Visual. Fade to black with overlay text. History is written by those who survive, but foresight can warn us all. Von Rundstedt's message is more than a historical anecdote, it is a cautionary tale. In times of crisis, ignoring reason and reality in favor of pride and ideology can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Normandy became a testing ground of impossibility, where human bravery, technological power, and flawed leadership collided in a tragic, unforgettable drama. Visual. Dramatic montage, Allied flags raised over captured towns, burning German tanks, soldiers walking through rubble, sunset over Normandy. As this chapter closes, we are left with a sobering reflection. The voice of clarity, no matter how wise or experienced, can be silenced by bureaucracy, fear, and ideology. Von Rundstedt's warning, though ignored, endures as a powerful reminder that recognizing the impossible is often the first step in preventing catastrophe, even if that step comes too late. Visual. Slow zoom on von Rundstedt's thoughtful face, maps fading into historical documents, closing text. The impossible can sometimes be foreseen, but ignored at your peril. The story does not end here. Normandy was just the beginning of the Western Front's collapse. The lessons of these 25 days of impossible odds, ignored warnings, and catastrophic decisions would reverberate through the remainder of the war and shape the history of Europe forever. Visual. Fade to black, cinematic music swells, text overlay. Subscribe to uncover more untold World War II stories.